Well, the world is a dumpster fire, and nothing here makes sense. And you're vacillate between crippling fear and constant self-defense. And nothing's right and nothing's good, and you're paralyzed with grief. Don't kill yourself, just have a cup of coffee.
Welcome to Coffee Over Suicide, the dramedy podcast about mental illness and choosing life over death, one cup of coffee at a time. I'm your host, Chris Parker Howard. And today on the show, we have got an absolute legend. He's a member of the famed sketch comedy group, The State, as well as the creator of Risk, a podcast where people tell true stories they never thought they'd dare to share. Ladies and gentlemen, Kevin Allison is on the show today. And this is really honestly a big deal for me because Risk was a huge inspiration. And that being said, let's get real. Let's get really real. Speaking of stories that people never thought they'd dare to share, I want to take this opportunity at the top of the show just for a couple of minutes before we get into the conversation with Kevin to talk a little bit about what I'm going through right now. Because see, the thing is, most of the time when I'm having a conversation about something, I've developed some sort of a lesson plan, some kind of an idea of something that can be learned from it. A way that you can take the pain and turn it into something useful, or take the embarrassment and turn it into a lesson. And at the moment, I'm going through some pretty high anxiety, and I haven't learned anything from it yet. In fact, there are times when I'm not even really sure that I can get through it, that I think that it's going to consume me completely to the point where I can't even move. It's kind of a weird situation to find myself in, especially after all of these years of learning coping mechanisms and ways to get through things. And here I am, naked in the woods with absolutely no defenses. It's like a variant on my own anxieties come in and infected me. But what are you going to do? I mean, what's the alternative? Lying about it and saying that I've got everything figured out this week and that it's going to be awesome. Because I don't think it is going to be awesome this week. I think that this introduction is going to be a little rambly and a little strange. And if you're a new listener, welcome. How you doing? But I thought it would be appropriate for me to be honest right up top and kind of talk a little bit about that struggle. Because the thing is this, I love listening to people talk about how they got over something, how they got past something, what they learned from it. But quite frankly, sometimes I really just want to hear that somebody's going through something and they haven't figured it out. And the main reason that I do this show, and I think a lot of people do shows that are similar to this, is because the idea is to take all of this that you're going through and turn it into something that might help somebody, something that can be of service to other people. Because we're all going through something. Everybody's going through something, especially right now. We're all in the middle of something. And so having a little bit of empathy for people while they haven't yet figured it out, and not expecting them to have answers, is something that we could all do a little better. And I'm having a hard time accepting that of myself. And yet I accept that of other people. Isn't that weird? Isn't that a strange thing? I can accept that somebody's going through something and they haven't figured it out, and maybe they're being a little testy or a little mean, or maybe they're being a little foolish, or maybe they seem like a frightened child when they're a full-grown adult, and there's judgments that come with that you dismiss, and you say, you know what, they're going through something. They'll figure it out. And yet, when you look at yourself, you can't have that same level of empathy and understanding. How weird is that? And I'm going through one of those moments right now. I've had some pretty strange anxiety for really, honestly, the entire month of September. And here we are, closing out the month of September. This is the last Friday in the month. And it is Suicide Prevention Month. So if you know someone in your life that's struggling, reach out, say hi, say something. Has this introduction been rambling enough? I know that you're all really, really champing at the bit to get to this conversation with Kevin Allison. So I am going to do that. Because honestly, all of this stuff with my anxiety and my stress and my roller coaster bipolar, I got nothing. I got no answers this week. I'm just on the lifeboat, getting by. Just getting by. That's enough. No grand lessons. No platitudes to put on a plaque on the wall. Just getting by. It's enough for right now. So let's talk to Kevin Allison. But that's actually a thing that I want to get into. Let's go ahead and just jump right in. I wanted to ask you right out of the gate, how has your pandemic been?
Oh, my God. I'll tell you, what's really interesting right now is constantly reassessing with people in my life who is still frazzled, still, who feels like they've like there was an earthquake in their therapy and they're, trying to just, put Band-Aids on everything. So yeah, my pandemic was pretty scary at first. The first Risk live stream, we were one of the first shows that we knew of to do a live stream because we had to cancel a show in Reno, Nevada on March 12th or something like that. And by the 15th, everything was locked down. So within a week, we had one of the first live stream shows up there, and it got us in the New York Times for an article about how people are adjusting. But that first night was incredibly heartening. I couldn't sleep after that show because it was so exciting how many people showed up and how excited everyone was that we were trying it this way. But, here's the thing. Very quickly, a lot of people started to feel actually, we don't like live streams all that much,
Yeah.
And now we're going through the same thing with live shows. When we came back, was it in July? I think July was the first Risk live show back in New York City at Caveat. We had to show a vaccination card and all that sort of thing. First night back, the place was crowded. People were just overwhelmed with joy. The show we did this past Wednesday, very small crowd, as if people are starting to get antsy again. As if people are I don't know. Someone pointed out to me that some people are well, let's see, I have to go to my nephew's birthday party next week. So do I want to risk being in a theater on a Wednesday night this week?
Right.
So yeah. The constant, it still feels like one day at a time, Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I went through kind of a strange situation myself because I was living in Denver, Colorado, and I moved to California in February, and then March comes, and I've been fucking nowhere.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
I've been nowhere. I've seen nothing. So I know the 2 miles of my neighborhood incredibly well.
How surreal.
And then the very first thing I did after getting vaccinated and wanting to get out in the world, my wife was like, we got to do something. Let's go to Disneyland.
Oh, wow.
So we went to Disneyland, and it was a shock to the senses. I'm a very introverted kind of person who I had to overcome a lot of social anxiety. I mean, so naturally I became a performer.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
I know this thing. Yeah.
Right. So a lot of it had come back, and I hadn't realized it because I had basically spent a year indoors. You know, it was kind of nuts. And I'm seeing that with a lot of people.
Yeah. I went to a gay bar for the first time 2 or 3 weeks ago and had a full-blown panic attack. I had to call an Uber home because, and it wasn't because of so much, fear about, oh my gosh, am I going to get sick or something like that?
Yeah.
No, it was just, oh my God, I forgot that being in gay bars can be like, scary sometimes in terms of like who's attracted to who, just all, like I don't know how kind of it can make me nervous to feel like you're auditioning sometimes when you see, attractive people around you and you're like, oh. Yeah. So no, I was like, whoa, I was off the rails, just not used to being out at a bar socializing and it freaked me out. Oh, gosh. Yeah.
Well, let's go back even farther. Talk to me a little bit about this, because you're from Cincinnati, right?
Yeah.
Where do you land on Skyline Chili?
Oh, I'm a big fan. Yes. I'm a big fan. It's terrible. I mean, I often get into trouble with it. I often have, it's the kind of thing you often will eat at 2:00 in the morning or that sort of thing.
Yes.
I like the one like there's one near the University of Cincinnati that is especially famous for being open very late and, everyone's drunk and no, it's definitely the kind of food that might backfire on you. But it's fun when you're eating it.
Yeah. I've had many a nights because I used to play in a punk rock band that traveled around and that was one of the greatest things about Ohio, especially Cincinnati. I mean, the Cincinnati area, the Dayton area, all of it's really, really interesting. But Cincinnati was a great artistic place for me. Let me ask how it was for you.
Well, yes. And this is an issue that comes up a lot because I tell so many stories on Risk that start in my childhood. And growing up in the 1970s, being one of those unusually precocious kids who knew from the beginning of consciousness that I was gay, was as I was learning language, was learning what it meant and all that kind of stuff. It was prolonged trauma for me to grow up a child knowing he was gay in an extremely Roman Catholic town. An extremely Roman Catholic and extremely Republican town.
Yeah.
Cincinnati in the 70s had a reputation for being sex negative. It was where the Mapplethorpe trial happened. It was where the Larry Flint trial happened.
Yeah. At
a certain point in time in my youth, you had to go across the river to be able to get a Penthouse magazine, it was a kind of a right-wing conservative feeling, sex negative kind of place. And my mom, who I love very dearly in so many ways, was very puritanical and very anti, she hated the word sex. When I was 12, I finally came out to myself out loud. I said, okay, I'm gay out loud. And it was after years and years and years of trying to deny that and trying to work around it, trying to maybe like girls as well, that kind of thing.
Right.
And I remember I was like, okay, there's no getting around it. I'm 12. I'm admitting it to myself. And Sexual Healing by Marvin Gaye was the number one song at the time. My sister and I are playing it in the kitchen. Mom walks in, turns the boombox off, and she said, when that song comes on the radio goes off. Wow. And I was like, I ain't talking to her about this anytime soon. So, yeah, my impression of Cincinnati is it's a very quirky place because there's the West Side, which is very working class. There's the East Side, which is, more posh and all that sort of thing. And there's a lot of old money there, but there's also a lot of art that started. Like, for example, the Mapplethorpe trial was just as I was leaving, or maybe had just arrived in New York. That was at the Cincinnati Contemporary Arts Museum. And then there's the College Conservatory of Music at CCM. Great, a lot of great opera singers and Broadway stars have come out of there. So there is a vibrant arts scene. Not the Metropolitan, what the hell am I talking about? The Cincinnati Opera was, for a long stretch of time, the only other major opera company that was fully functioning well enough for people like Maria Callas or Ezio Pinza or whoever to come through Cincinnati before going to the Met.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so my dad, when he was 10 years old, started going to the opera, and he saw some of the world's greatest stars in Cincinnati. Yeah. So it's there's a lot of contradictions in the town, but in my stories, it's always this place I wanted to escape from to get to New York City. Because as a kid, when I was 11 years old, I saw that the Boys in the Band would be playing on television at 2:00 in the morning. Mm-hmm. And then another night it was the Times of Harvey Milk. And so I was getting these glimpses of New York City in movies and was like, oh my God, I've got to get there. Although, of course, Times of Harvey Milk is mostly San Francisco, but still there's parts in New York.
Right.
And I was like, that's where I've got to get after high school. I've got to get there. Yeah.
So what's your relationship with Cincinnati like now? I mean, now that you've got your distance with it, because I know that being a person from, kind of a similar area, I was raised in Saginaw, Michigan, and it was just kind of a very similar area. And I realize I have a lot of baggage with that place. Yeah. And I feel like I'm a different person from that place. And going back there, I haven't been there in years, and I avoid it. I avoid it as much as I can. And I'm going back now. I don't know why. I'm going to go back and I'm going to visit. I have some people there that I still care about, and I want to go check in face to face. Yeah. But man, there's some baggage.
I talk in my therapy all the time about having a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde sort of feeling about myself, and it comes from my childhood. It comes from learning very adeptly how to be a good boy and learning very adeptly how to be a total freak in ways that people could deal with that would charm them, like comedian, class clown kind of stuff, right? Yeah. To send the signal to my peers, there's something weird about me inside, but I'm going to make you feel like it's fun and all that sort of thing. So for example, here's how it would play out when I was in college. I would go home to Cincinnati and ride the plane and would start to feel a little bit suffocated. Like the movie Get Out.
Yes.
Caused me so much agita. It was funny to be a white person watching that movie and feeling like, oh my God, I feel like this is scaring me more than it is some other people because, I was so reminded of that world.
Yeah.
I would take the plane to Cincinnati and feel like I was going back into the closet or something like that. And on the trips home, this is in college when I was just so horny, right?
Yeah.
I would go straight to a sex club. Once I sat down in New York City, I'd go straight to a 24-hour sex club and check my luggage, just be like, can you guys just put this luggage behind the thing while that was the need to get Mr. Hyde out of me as soon as I was back from Cincinnati.
Well, it's the new church, this is where you go to feel the most yourself.
Yeah. So how do I feel about it now? Well, when we did the Risk show in Cincinnati for the first time, 2 years ago, and I had put off going there for the longest time because I was afraid that my parents might want to come to the show.
Right.
And I was also afraid that some of my high school friends might not know how to deal with it. I just didn't want to have to deal with going back to Cincinnati. But finally, JC was like, there's only so many major cities, and we have listeners there. So we finally did go to Cincinnati to do the show. My parents did not come. I kind of, told them, you don't want to come.
Right.
And actually, my cousin told a story at that show, and it was a fabulous show, and a lot of people from high school showed up. I really do feel like the city has grown hipper and hipper, especially in pockets. The Over the Rhine area is now very, very hip, lots of microbreweries and stuff like that. I think this is very typical of almost any big American city now, is that there's going to be the more bohemian, hip part, and more outward expressions of gay pride and all that kind of thing. So I think it has come a ways.
I definitely want to get into some of the later part of your story, which is amazing. But I think that it requires some context in order to get us there. And so we have to talk about moving to New York and where that led us. So tell me about New York for the first time, when you got there.
Yeah. Well, what happened was, so we were talking before about coming out to my parents.
Yeah.
I did put it off till the last second. I decided when the financial aid has come through for going to NYU and when the plane tickets have been purchased, so I'm definitely going to be going to NYU.
Yeah.
Then I'll come out. So it was a week before going off to college. I sit down with my parents and I came out. And, it's funny because a kid spends so much time being like, what might happen? Because you really don't know. But when you look back, you're like, oh, what happened was pretty predictable. Dad took it totally well. And mom did not and wanted me to go into the priesthood, et cetera, et cetera. But she eventually came around. There was, fortunately, the play, it was a little too late to be going into the seminary because I was set to go to NYU. But when I arrived, that's the second story I ever told on Risk is within that first week of being in New York City, I ended up looking for sex at 3 or 4 in the morning in Central Park. So I'm 18 years old and I am jumping in head first. Had no idea what I was doing. And it was dangerous. I mean, it's funny. So, someone told me that not post-pandemic, but at this stage in time, the Ramble in New York is back to the extent that DJs are playing there. What? Like this is like the oldest of gay cruising grounds.
Yeah.
And Rudy Giuliani just got rid of it, along with so much of sex culture in the late 90s.
Yeah.
He just really like cracked down on things.
Yeah,
so
you
the
got
Ramble
your
didn't
Auntie
even
Anne's
like
pretzels in your Disney stores and
yeah,
all of that shit.
exactly.
Yeah.
But apparently the Ramble's back. But when I first arrived in 1988, it was a place to go. And my first story is looking for it, not knowing where to find it, getting lost because my ADHD kind of like, I didn't even get diagnosed until a couple of years ago, but it's really hilarious to now look back at these old stories and see how it's always coming up. It was a Risk fan who wrote to me, dude, do you not realize you have ADHD?
That's
and
amazing.
At the time, yeah, I got that email at the same time that I was texting a friend from college. I was like, this is so funny. I just got a email from a Risk fan saying, don't you know you have ADHD? And my friend from college was like, well, don't you? And I was like, wait a minute, okay, maybe I should go to a doctor. And the doctor was like, definitely.
And you were like, what?
Yeah. But no, yeah. So I dove in head first, and that first night was just a fiasco because I was drunk. I lost my shoes. I ended up just with some random businessman who happened to be passing through that part of the park because I was not in the right part of the park.
Right.
I ran to the subway afterwards and tried to catch it and threw up into the train and then slipped on my own mess and fell and like waved to everyone. Oh, it was just ridiculous. But it made for a phenomenal second story to tell on Risk. In the early days of Risk, it was really my idea of allow me to show people that it's okay to talk about anything on this podcast. But, you know, it's very much the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing. In the same way that when I went into kindergarten in first grade, I was like, oh, my God, what if they find out I'm gay? Well, if I'm charming and funny first, I'll be weird, but it's okay. Same thing with Risk. Like, when I started the show, I was like, if I tell stories about crazy, kinky sexual adventures, but but I'm fun and friendly and good-hearted and all that sort of thing, it'll help people to feel like, oh, we can talk about anything on this show. And indeed it did, like people started coming to talk about traumas that I don't, child abuse or rape or stuff like that I have no experience with,
Yeah.
I mean, in that way, Risk has been a real learning experience for me, But that was my first week in New York, diving in head first. And my 20s, I was just famous for adventures out in the city. There was a lot more cruising in random places. I mean, I had sex on subway trains, in abandoned buildings, down on the docks, just craziness.
and you tell all of these stories, and you tell them with a laugh on your lips, and you are a bright, day-glow white man with no red in your face whatsoever when you share these stories. And I'm really, really fascinated by how a person gets there to the place where you're sharing, and some would say, many would say, a lot would say, oversharing.
Right.
These kinds of stories. Like, how do you become a person who is that level of comfortable, not only with yourself, but with sharing that level of stuff and having so much fun with it?
So in between coming to New York and starting Risk when I was 39, there was The State, my sketch comedy group.
Yeah.
We all met at NYU. and there were 11 of us, and it was 10 guys and 1 girl, and I was the only gay person in the group. And it was interesting. I was hyper aware of the fact that Carrie was really great at dealing with sexism when it cropped up in jokes. Mm-hmm. I was not so good at defending myself when homophobia came up in jokes with the group, because the group was very roasty, as comedians tend to be.
Yeah.
Knocking each other down a peg with jokes. And I wasn't good at dealing with that. But I did find that the group really enjoyed my true stories of these adventures that I had when I was away from them. Because 11 of us, during our 4 years at NYU and then our 4 or 5 years together after that when we were on MTV, the group was basically everyone's co-workers and best friends. So the group was constantly hanging out. I was the black sheep who would go off on my own without the group to be with my gay friends or having my sex adventures. When we got to MTV, I was so uncomfortable with how roasty the group could be that I suggested, when we start our work days here at MTV, can we start with a check-in where we go around for at least a half hour and everyone says where they're at in life, whether or not they want to get complete about something that happened yesterday or just say, I'm having trouble with my mom or whatever it might be. Let's just have an emotional check-in. And Tom Lennon was very funny because after we had been doing check-ins for a couple of weeks, he was like, well, of course Kevin wanted to start this. He's got these incredibly hilarious stories every day about whatever the hell he was up to last night.
Right.
So I kind of learned how to do it there. And then, and it was Michael Black.
Yeah.
Michael Black from the State always said to me, why don't you get up on stage and start sharing these like that? And I really avoided it for years until I did a solo show in San Francisco, and he was there, and the show bombed. It did not work out well. I was 5 different crazy, kooky characters, so I was trying to do sketch comedy alone. Like Andy Kaufman, kind of.
Yeah.
But afterwards, Black said, oh, man, there was one point in the show where you just were talking to us as you between the characters.
Yeah.
And he was like, I think the whole audience was like, oh, no, wait, you stay, just be yourself and tell us true stories. So at that point, I was so down and out. I was so in debt, getting nowhere with like agents and auditions and stuff like that. I was just like, my career had just like died. I was just in a very belly of the whale bad place. And so when he said, why don't you give telling true stories a try, that time I was 39 and I was finally ready. And I'll tell you, I was just telling this anecdote the other day on Risk, because Kelly Carlin did the show, and there's a George Carlin connection to all of this, is that my mother used to be horrified about any art that I would create that wasn't totally family friendly.
Right.
So in high school and then in college, and especially when the State was on MTV, you're so vulnerable. I was, 23 years old when the State was on MTV, and I was being characters like the redhead gay, so I was coming out on national television. So you're kind of vulnerable, and then you talk to your mom, and she's like upset every week because of some dumbass random joke that referred to sex being a thing that exists, Right. But the mantra that she used to say to me all throughout my youth and into my adulthood was, why do you have to be like George Carlin? Be like Bill Cosby. And I told Kelly Carlin this the other day when we featured her show, and she was like, oh my God, my mom or my dad would have loved hearing that story. Seeing as how like that advice didn't age well.
No.
But that was it. The idea was when I got back from that San Francisco show, I was like, okay, I'll tell a true story in front of an audience. I'll take the dare that Mike mentioned to me. And I reached out to a friend who I knew had a storytelling show. I had never been to a storytelling show. I had heard of The Moth and knew what it was about, but I'd never been. So a friend of mine had a storytelling show where all the stories had to be about sex. And I reached out to her, Margot Lightman, and I said, oh, I could tell a story. The riskiest thing I can think of, because Michael Black had said, the riskier, the better. And I said, how about a story about the first time I prostituted myself when I was, I think, 22? And she said, that's great. But on the day of the show, I tried to back out. I was like, oh, this feels too risky. Oh, my God, I'm going to horrify this is going to be a bad, traumatic experience if people hate it. She was like, no. On the day of the show, someone usually tries to back out because these are stories about sex and people feel scared about sharing them. But if I can convince that person to do it, that's probably going to be the one that hits it out of the park that night because it's risky.
Yeah.
So that night at UCB, I'm 39 years old. I share the story of the first time I prostituted myself on stage at UCB. And it was really funny because the audience it looked like mostly frat boys. Like I was like, this is not, I don't know if they're going to understand.
Yeah.
But they loved it. And it was really a eureka moment because every time I got to a place in the story where it's like, oh my God, I sound way too gay here, or oh God, I sound too Midwestern and polite here, or just any of these self-critical voices in my head that started with my mom, basically.
Yeah.
I just pushed past through them, and people kept being more and more interested in how honest I was being. So I was lit up like a candle after that show because I felt like I had connected with an audience like I hadn't in many years.
Yeah.
And I walked down 8th Avenue away from that show of Margot Lightman's, and I thought, this is it. Risk. I'll call the show Risk. It will force me to get over my stage fright because I'll be up on stage a lot. It'll this theme of getting people to come out of the closet about whatever seems like a natural fit for me. This will be a way to kind of say fuck you to my mom in my head and to the authority figures, the gatekeepers of the entertainment industry. I'll kind of forge my own path, do it yourself. And the whole idea just came together that night. And that it's funny that the show became precisely what I first intended it to be, where there's plenty of hilarious stories on the show, and there's plenty of my own crazy, kinky stories, but there's also stories that are like very frightening or very beautiful, like what one person considers risky to be sharing from person to person can be very, very different. Yeah.
I found a lot of bravery in it. When I found the show, I was actually in kind of a strange position myself. And I find that the risky positions you find yourself in can sometimes be the best positions for you to be in for any kind of growth.
Yeah.
And I had just moved out of Michigan into Colorado, fish out of water. I had never done anything remotely risky that could benefit me in my life up to that point. And I just decided I'm going to go for it. I don't know what I'm doing exactly, but I'm going to do it with enthusiasm.
Fabulous.
And I found the podcast, and it was like Kevin Allison. Is that the Kevin Allison? And I had to look it up. Oh my God. Right. This is what he's doing. Absolutely. Let me check this out. In the very first episode, it ran the gamut of all of the kinds of stories that somebody could tell. And that really stuck with me because, of course, there were your exuberant sex stories, which are hilarious and amazing. And there was an incredibly sad story that a man told about, I believe it was his wife was dying of cancer, and the things that he learned about being with her and staying with her. And then there was another story that I don't quite remember, but it was I remember it was a woman telling a story about farting during an orgasm. I mean, it was just there was all kinds of stuff like that, and it was all in the same episode. And it was like I remember telling people about it and saying, I think you could listen to this from this time code to this time code.
Yes. You know, that is, we're going through a huge period of transition right now.
Yeah.
Because we're creating, after 12 years, we're creating another podcast. This one is going to be called Real, and it will premiere in next year in 2022. But what we finally realized is that there are folks out there who would love so many of these stories that we work on for the show, but they're afraid of running into something that might be too challenging or something that, like they might like to listen to podcasts in the car with their kids, more of your NPR kind of listener.
Yeah.
And we do know we've got plenty of material, and we workshop material that just remove some curse words or steer clear of getting into too much detail about this or that. And you've got a story that is still very revealing and illuminating, but it doesn't need trigger warnings and an explicit label and all that.
Yeah.
So we're hoping to reach a whole new audience that way because, we realize that there is a risk in listening to risk. You know, like the first story you might hear might be just totally like almost family friendly, and then all of a sudden you've turned a corner and you're into something like
there have been times when I've been riding the train and my face will just go beet red, and it's like I can't deal with this right now. I can't do this in public. I can't listen to this. But as far as that podcast goes and creating that space for yourself from all of the opportunity, I think it's important to contextualize that the state for a bright moment was a very big deal, and then it was gone.
Right.
It was very public. It was it was really funny, really fast, and then out the door almost as soon as it wedged itself into everybody's hearts. You were in the very first sketch, the very first person seen on screen. Mm-hmm. And to go from something that was that big a deal and to find out very quickly that the show is bigger than you. How do you go? Because I know that there was a transition period for you, like you had hit kind of a weird wall before you found the podcast. Can you talk to me just a little bit about how you fell into it and then how you got out of it?
Well, it's interesting. I think that it would probably be a good idea at one point in time to actually craft a story about what I call my belly of the whale years. Because that period of my life is the period about which I have the most regrets. But we have to have a lot of compassion with ourselves about periods of our lives where we're like, oh man, I kept fucking up, didn't I?
Yeah.
Because the group, the state, we made about 30 episodes for MTV, and not so much me, but certain members of the group, I think, started to get big for their britches. And we're like, nah, screw this. It's time for the big times. Let's go to one of the big networks, and ABC was looking at us to go up against Saturday Night Live. Then that fell through, so we went to CBS. We did one Halloween special at CBS, even though we had this contract to do a bunch. And they fired us immediately. Les Moonbase had just been hired, and he was like, who are these kids? Whatever, they fired us. And all of a sudden, we were in this weird limbo where I wanted to just go back to MTV, which we probably could have.
Yeah.
But no, the group wanted to do something different. And we went through, it was very, whenever I read about the breakup of the Beatles and how it was really a couple of years of things getting more and more frayed between them, that's how it was for us. We just couldn't withstand the tumultuous times or the big question mark times of no longer being on MTV and what's next for us. Are we going to last? So there was a lot of kind of backstabbing and fighting, and the group broke up in 1996. And I took it the worst of all the members of the group because I was most afraid of carving out a solo career. I really had seen the group as a sort of protective womb, for example, when we would sit down with network executives or casting agents and managers, all those kind of people, they were a bit daunted that they were looking at 11 different people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The executives at MTV would be like, we're not sure this is funny. And then 11 23-year-olds are like, no, it is. You know what I mean? It was we started to get our way with them. So I was afraid because I always felt like the gatekeepers don't get me. I'm the weird one. I always felt like on your show of shows, which the writer's room was Neil Simon and Woody Allen and Carl Reiner and Sid Caesar and just all these amazing comedy writers. But Mel Brooks was the guy who everyone knew as, when Mel brings a sketch in, we're going to laugh our asses off. And there's no way we're going to put it on television.
Yeah.
And I was that guy in the state. I was always coming in with these things that were so surreal or just pushing the envelope and all that sort of thing, where the executives were like, we don't know about this one, which really I just didn't. And another thing I didn't do well, when something was rejected, I watched other members of the group be like, okay, back to the drawing board. Whereas when something of mine was rejected, I was so sensitive. I would be nursing a wound for a week. I think the group itself began to understand Kevin is a little too... Well, his self-esteem, his self-confidence is just not as bounce-backable as the rest of us. So when the group broke up, I remember David Wayne was like, hey, let's get back together to work on a project. And now this is before email was even a thing.
Right.
I wrote a letter to him back saying that I felt like the group had been torn apart by arrogance and greed, and I was not ready to do something with the rest of the group again. And he kind of shared that with the rest of the group. And the next thing that was happening was Wet Hot American Summer, and they didn't include me.
Yeah.
So I kind of shot myself in the foot during that period of drinking too much, avoiding getting on stage, not taking classes. I could have just jumped right into improv classes and started learning new chops. Improv is so good. We were a sketch comedy group. We were married to the word with scripting things out and rehearsing it. But improv is good for anyone to take classes in at least because it teaches you that it's okay to fail. You fail, doesn't make a difference. You fail, doesn't make a difference. You fail, doesn't make a difference. Then you succeed. Like that's how you look. Stephen Colbert talks about that all the time. Learning to love bombing, because this is making you stronger.
Right.
Yeah, and I didn't. I was in more of a fixed mindset rather than a growth mindset. Yeah.
So how did you get there to that growth mindset? Did you start seeing a therapist at some point in that?
Yes, but she colluded with me.
What?
She was a Jungian. She was very. I would call her goth. Like I'm sure she'd be insulted by that term, but she was always very dressed in dark things, dark makeup. She had a painting behind her of like naked, dead children. They appear to be dead or asleep, lying in a road. It's like, what the fuck is this?
Like, this is the therapist I want.
Right. And she was like, Kevin, comedy is frivolous. You should write the great American novel. And I colluded with her and decided to run away. I decided to give up the performing arts. This is when I was 30. So this is about 4 years after the state broke up. I decided to go back to college. I started going to Hunter to get my master's. I was going to become an English professor. And then in the meantime, become an editor of books. And so I got myself a 9-to-5 job at a small book publishing company. And it took about 4 years of that to realize this is not working out. I need to express myself with my voice. And that's the point in 2005 when a woman wrote to me and said, hey, you're Kevin Allison of the State. I'm putting together a writing school. Could you teach a class on writing sketch comedy? And I was like, anything to get me out of this 9-to-5, thing, just something different to do.
Yeah.
And that first night of teaching, I couldn't believe it because, they were all fans of the State, all these young folks I was teaching. But also I recognized, oh my gosh, I was able to be totally silly with them. And then sometimes totally sincere, and sometimes even like totally kind of inappropriate, talking about kinky stuff,
Yeah.
So like that really got me starting to, I think, unconsciously understand that I can stand in front of people simply being myself and hold the room that way. And so I think that kind of grew. And so that when Michael Ian Black a few years later was like, I think you ought to start telling true stories, I think I was much readier to hear that at that point. Yeah. I remember when I started Risk, it was a real come hell or high water thing because I was married and my husband said, you've started this podcast and I know you love it, but it's 24/7. Like you are working on this constantly and making no money. And in fact, using like credit cards to like take care of the thing. He's like, it's either you get a full-time job again, or I'm out of here. So and I said, well, that feels like it's either Risk or the marriage. And he's like, yeah, I think so. And I chose Risk, Fortunately, I insisted on one thing, that we remain friends. And we are. We're very dear friends to this day. And of course, that opened up a whole new batch of sexual adventures. Which was fodder for the show.
So how does this storytelling that's come into your life and turned into this great output of creative energy into the universe, and there's so much that's wonderful about it. You said that it's given you an opportunity to learn a bunch of things that you hadn't known before. What kind of an effect has this, let's say, explosive honesty that you've had on your mental health?
Oh, that's a very good question. I used to, in the early days, I used to say, "Oh, no. This is okay. I'm totally okay with all of this." But it was 2014 or 2015. So, like halfway, or 5 years into Risk, I did enter into therapy again because I wanted to be able to talk about, I continue obviously to have a lot of my own issues, but I did realize that I was taking on a lot of other people's heaviness sometimes. It was one of the phenomena that happens with the show is that when a certain story comes out that makes a big impression, then a lot of people who have had a similar thing happen will reach out to us at the same time, pitching us their stories. So it was especially when like a wave of child molestation stories would pile up in the inbox where I would be apologizing to people. I would reach out to people and let them know, I'm so moved. Hopefully we can get to this at some point. I'm a little overwhelmed right now. And, it's heavy. It's heavy sometimes to kind of look around. This was all like before. I feel like a lot of the things that everyone has learned since Me Too, since the whole Me Too thing, I think Me Too has made people a lot more conscious of a lot more abuse happening out there. But I think I was kind of going through a similar thing, just with all these pitches I was dealing with at some point. So yeah, there is. I've always been a huge fan of Carl Jung, and I love the idea of the wounded healer. Like, I've always really loved his life story and how he felt like a freak as a child and, really had to felt abandoned and all this, all these things that I can kind of relate to, but then love how he took so many risks with his own exploration of things and was able to one of the things I love about him is how everyone says that in the last 30 years or so of his life, he was very lovable. Everyone loved him. He was as opposed to Freud or
right.
So yeah, I embrace the whole idea of being the wounded healer, but sometimes I realize, oh my gosh, there's burnout. It's possible to burn out. It's possible to need to step away for a little bit sometimes. Yeah.
Well, I could talk to you for another 5 years. There's so many questions and so many things, but all I can say is thank you for talking to me today, Kevin.
Oh, thank you. This was such a pleasure. I really enjoyed this. We got into some nitty-gritty stuff. And so, yeah, anyone can find Risk at, wherever you can download a podcast, but also at risk-show.com. But also look out for Real. Real is coming next year, and you really can listen to it without worrying that it's going to get too challenging. I mean, it'll still be emotional.
Right.
You still might cry sometimes.
But there might not be stories about, tying shoes to your balls.
Right, exactly.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks so much.
Wasn't that great? God, that was an absolute blast. I did not even get to cover everything that I wanted to talk about because how do you cram all of that into an hour? We'll have to have him on the show again sometime further down the road. Until then, if you want to get some more Kevin Allison in your life, and I know that you do, go to risk-show.com or find the Risk Podcast everywhere fine podcasts are found. You can also find him at kevinallison.net. As for me, I'll be back again next week. Is the video working for you? Is it not working for you? Do I got a face for radio or what? Let me know in the comments. Just let me know something, because I do not have it figured out right now. So until next week, don't kill yourselves out there. And that goes for me too.